The 1987 development and release of Final Fantasy has become the stuff of legend. A fledgling game director, Hironobu Sakaguchi, fighting an uphill battle with his employers at Square to greenlight an RPG. His motley team, including graduate turned accidental composer Nobuo Uematsu, esteemed anime writer Kenji Terada, and a non-Japanese speaking programmer, Nazir Gebeli, who had been wooed over to Japan with vague promises of a mansion, to name but a few, make the origins of Final Fantasy seem like the premise of a success against all odds Netflix series, rather than a reality. Yet this was one of the very real circumstances to be found in the porous, unstructured makeup of the early Japanese games industry, and the attraction it had to those, mostly graduate programmers, who wanted to dip their toe in something creative before going off to get a real job in one of the monolithic zaibotsus of Japanese industry. Yet, Final Fantasy, so called in part because of its self-contained story, and in 1987 at least, its potential to be the only RPG released by Square, turned out to not simply be a success, but the beginnings of a series that would come to shape the idea of the JRPG genre through the 1990s and beyond, and forever define the careers of those who worked on it. And indeed, right off the bat, while 1987's Final Fantasy is very much a product of its time today, and even accounting for remasters and ports that it's had over the years, it is considerably dated by today's standards. Here we are going to explore the innovations, tropes and approach to game design that it brought to the table of the burgeoning RPG game genre, helmed by the delegative vision of Hironobu Sakaguchi. Now, despite its reputation today, Final Fantasy was far from a pioneering start for RPG gaming. Indeed, Sakaguchi had only been able to get buy-in for the project after his employers had seen the success of Chunsoft and Enix's 1986 game Dragon Quest, which proved the formula in many ways and smoothed out the edges of earlier, more experimental Japanese RPG games such as Hydlide, Dragon Slayer, and The Dragon and the Princess. And each of these games, as the titles suggest, were inspired by the knights and mages sorts of fantasies rooted in Western folklore, and many, including Sakaguchi's inspiration for Final Fantasy, have their roots in the lore and mechanics of the famous tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. But where titles like Dragon Quest merely nodded to the genre, Sakaguchi sought to lift more from the framework of the D&D tabletop format, and indeed the earlier Western RPG games it had inspired, such as Surtek's 1981's Wizardry, and most specifically Richard Garriott's 1981 game Ultima. And each of these inspirations in their own way served to set Final Fantasy apart, making it a historically significant game. For example, Dragon Quest unfolded through the actions of the solitary protagonist character, Hero, echoing existent platformers and adventure titles of the time, where the player had a direct one-to-one relationship to the game through a single avatar, so Link in Zelda, Mario, and so on. The intentionally mute and generic hero character was the analogue of the player within the game world, and it allowed them to an extent to project themselves into the events. Final Fantasy, by comparison, employed an ensemble cast from the very beginning, with 4 characters, the Light Warriors, helming both gameplay and story. And this aspect of Final Fantasy, inherited from the multiplayer spirit of tabletop RPGs, was a significant aspect of the game that in many ways would become the cornerstone for each subsequent instalment, and the JRPG titles that it inspired, with tales of camaraderie and fellowship unfolding in a very Tolkien-esque sort of way through most of these adventures. Final Fantasy also brought innovations in game design, which I think augments and relates to this sense of fellowship, by switching from the prevailing first-person view of the battle screen to a side view, where our party characters appear on the right-hand side of the screen and the enemies on the left, and thus enable us to visually see our party members, which not only augments this sense of camaraderie and fellowship, but it allowed players to see the results of their decision in choosing certain character classes, and also observe their party in action, and so commands issued, whether that's an attack or magic or whatever, in the battle menu, had a direct visual and animated correlation to what the characters did on screen, swinging a sword, casting fire, healing, so on, along with providing those numerical statistics to communicate damage, health, status. And the decision to visualise the party also allowed the players to familiarise with the now famous designs of Final Fantasy's character classes, such as the red, white and black mages, and maintain the pseudo-multiplayer collective spirit of the tabletop RPG throughout this adventure. Incidentally, I was thinking about this just the other day, about whether it's actually strange that the player characters often appear on the right-hand side of the screen, particularly in older Final Fantasy games. And I did wonder whether this was because Japanese traditionally read vertically and right to left, rather than left to right. So perhaps the right-hand side would be the natural focal point for a Japanese player. But it is an interesting aspect of design here that was established from the outset. Now, it would be disingenuous to overstate how much the Fellowship quest comes across in Final Fantasy I, since unlike later games that famously amalgamated and in some cases replaced character classes with unique personalities, identities, and character arcs in these stories, the first instalment, much like Dragon Quest's anonymous hero character, had a blank slate quartet of characters for whom we choose their class, but beyond that are very much left to us, the player, to interpret and imagine their characteristics, personalities, and roles in the story. And so Final Fantasy I is very much driven by the mechanics of the character's abilities, rather than anything narratively driven or to do with story. And actually, I received a comment on the channel just the other day where it was suggested that Final Fantasy X was a character-focused, kind of trope-driven game, while Final Fantasy XII was much more a window into a world and setting sort of game, and it was more about the world almost as character. And I think that latter suggestion certainly holds true for the first Final Fantasy game, where in the absence of character stories, the world is brought to life by an array of rudimentary scenarios, environments and NPCs to interact with and overcome and propel things forward. And indeed, really looking back and appraising Final Fantasy I, we can see a lot of the elements that would persist through the series. Most obviously, and most oft commented upon, is what has become a major trope in Final Fantasy, which is the crystals, which we often have to salvage or destroy in various stories across the anthology. But more subtly too, we see aspects of the science fantasy setting shine through from the very outset. And actually, I'm reading a book at the moment called Revolution by the game designer Tony Warrener, who worked on Broken Sword and that stuff at Revolution Software. And his career very much took off in the 1980s, around the same time as Sakaguchi. And he states in that book that people making games in this period of time were inspired either by Tolkien or by Blade Runner. They were either making high fantasy or sci-fi, and there was not much in between. But one of the interesting observations and interesting things about Final Fantasy is that from the outset, from the very first game in 1987, they sought to do both. And while it's often noted by players that Final Fantasy became more futuristic with games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, actually, since the very beginning, they've employed science fantasy conventions quite equally, and FF1 had bizarre additions like time travel and Sky Fortress space stations populated by war mechs and so on, which were all melded in with mythical behemoths like Tiamat and Bahamut, and more fantasy-orientated conventions like the aforementioned mages in the character classes, dark elves, and the elemental fiends. So, moving on, I often take time to delve into story analysis and character arcs when I review, but to be honest, it would be impractical to try and labour on any metaphor or inherent meaning within Final Fantasy I. And indeed, the opening gambit of a kingdom in crisis because of a kidnapped princess is straight out of the 1980s zeitgeist of gaming, with games like Double Dragon, Kung Fu, and of course Super Mario, all hinging around this very basic narrative principle of a kidnapped girlfriend or kidnapped princess. And likewise, the salvaging of magical items to facilitate dungeon crawls is another popular trope of the time, and indeed is echoed in fetch quests that we have in RPGs today, that on the one hand make a clear nod back to myth, legend, and of course Tolkien, where heroes are expected to acquire these sacred items to complete their quest, but also from a purely mechanical sense, it creates that necessity and a very basic but plausible reason to have this grinding combat take place in an effort to level up and improve our characters, which is part and parcel of the RPG. And while Final Fantasy can seem like a patchwork of weird tangent quest lines and an almost stream of consciousness approach to how the adventure unfolds, I think stepping back, we can appreciate the context of the time, which had limited ability to tell story, and thus focused much more towards the mechanics, that grinding, levelling necessity for completion that is part and parcel of the JRPG, and was certainly the more significant factor in the first 3 Final Fantasy games. And while from the outset, and as we've seen in interviews with scenario writer Kenji Terada from the time, Hironobu Sakaguchi was always attentive to storytelling. It was something that would evolve in the series and actually come to fruition quite quickly and ambitiously in the follow-up Final Fantasy II, which I'll discuss another time. But as I say, there was a clear slant towards the grinding, the dungeon crawling and the levelling here, owing to the limitations of the time. I think coming on to a final significant factor that set Final Fantasy I apart is its notable approach to setting, escalation and overworld game design, typified today by what is termed as the broken bridge or railroading in game design, and it continues to populate RPG titles to some degree or another to this day. So where Final Fantasy lacked in story, it went really big on setting. It featured a world map that was partitioned into 3 distinct continents, offering the illusion of freedom and scope. And the progression of story scenarios were contained by natural obstacles such as mountains and a broken bridge that prevented an uninhibited open world experience that would later become the standard for quote marks Western or sandbox RPGs such as the Elder Scrolls series, and instead offered a controlled freedom and narratively focused linearity by, for example, confining our party to the Cornelia region at the beginning of the game, as we were funneled through a very basic onboarding sequence until the context and purpose is offered to us by the king, and it's only by completing our first quest that the king rewards us by rebuilding the broken bridge and letting us explore beyond the reaches of Cornelia. And this approach to design and game setting set a precedent by adding acquirable modes and escalating modes of transport at narrative milestones such as a boat, an airship and so on, which increasingly liberated the player's experience of the overworld and once again made Final Fantasy unique for its time and inspired many games in the blossoming JRPG genre. So to conclude here with this short look back at Final Fantasy, the innovations it brought to bear on the fledgling genre can't be understated. I think it can be appreciated not so much as a historical footnote of a series that went on to give us Final Fantasy VII, and I think that's often how it may be thought of by players, but it is actually a significant moment in the evolution of video games that from the outset was able to broaden appeal and popularity of the RPG genre, which was also amplified by fortuitous external circumstances, such as the post-video game crash of 1983, giving a competitive edge to Nintendo and Japanese third-party developers like Squaresoft, and enabled them to push their games a bit more. But I think that's a discussion for another day, and kind of extraneous to the evolution of Final Fantasy specifically. And ultimately, while I think it would be impractical and disingenuous to say that Final Fantasy of 1987 was seminal or game-changing, for example, characterization and coherent storytelling was virtually non-existent until later games, and it was something that actually other attempts at JRPGs, such as Phantasy Star by Sega, which was released 2 days after Final Fantasy I, was employing from the outset. I would say that Final Fantasy certainly had enough innovations in its approach to game design and mechanics to differentiate it in the market at that time and nudge the genre into an ambitious new direction, and set the standard for later installments to follow. And while, as we will see, and as is still debated and controversial about Final Fantasy games to this day, where we find titles like Dragon Quest committed to its style and actually have remained relatively homogeneous in design to this very day, Final Fantasy's willingness to experiment with plot, character, mechanics, all of these essential elements and ingredients of game design were really pushed and radically altered in the successive titles, as we shall see.